All right. So this is only my second time in Ottawa, and it's great coming from New England, trading one frozen wasteland for another. So it's really fun to be up here. I'm going to talk about Stencil. If you've heard of it, you may have some questions or ideas, but really I want to focus on another subject of this talk: how I learned to stop worrying and love standards, for anyone who's ever watched Dr. Strangelove. So I spend a lot of my time with this framework, Angular. It's kind of my framework of choice. You may have opinions on it, and that's quite okay. There's also this new framework that's coming out called Vue. It's kind of getting popular. They just had their very first US conference in New Orleans that I got to attend. And also, the original cool kid, React. Can't go to a conference and not mention React. It kind of has to be talked about. But those aren't the only frameworks that are out there. Let's prepare ourselves. There's also Ember, Preact, Vue.js, Skate.js, CanJS, DO.js, HyperHTML, HyperApp, ViperHTML, Surplus, Dojo, Polymer, Stimulus, Aurelia, Knockout, Backbone, Marionette, Riot, Inferno, Svelte, Marco, and Mithril. And that's only just like the first 10 or 15 that I can find on GitHub. Seriously, go troll throughout the entire GitHub site for like JavaScript frameworks. I say JavaScript, not JavaScript. You're going to find like a new framework that is out there that maybe no one's heard about, but it exists. And this is kind of a problem. How are we supposed to like teach people these new concepts if like every 5 minutes there's a new Hacker News post about the next greatest framework that exists out there? Really, right? No one wants to deal with that. In fact, while I was up here, I created my own JavaScript framework. It's called Mike.js. It's a very subtle framework. It focuses on being very dry with a slight undertone of sarcasm. But this is like the reality of things. Like, we have to worry about the fact that there's a lot of JavaScript frameworks. And while some people consider this like a JavaScript Renaissance, it's kind of problematic. And one of the big points that we have to deal with is that every time a JavaScript framework comes out, they all say, oh, it uses JSX and Virtual DOM as these hype words to be super cool. But all of their component implementations are super isolated. So if I want to create a component in, say, React, and then I change jobs, I was like, oh, can I just use this in Vue? No. You have to either include all of the React runtime to work inside of Vue, or you just start over. This becomes equally more apparent, more of an issue as frameworks evolve, considering anyone who went from Angular 1 to Angular. It might as well have been a different framework, and no matter how many times people try to market it as otherwise, it's not fun to deal with. So it becomes pretty clear that we're not doing anything revolutionary, though. So for instance, for those who are Angular, who are not Angular fluent, we have a component here. Basically, we're just saying that this class is going to be a component. We're going to, when we want to render it, we're going to use approot, and then this is our internal template. Nothing too crazy here. Preact, or React, they're even more fancy with their extends component. We're going to return a div, and it's just going to render out hello world. And when we actually want to use that, we'll just create a tag for approot, all caps, because JSX. And then Vue, it has something similar. We have this concept of, here is our tag in the form of this approot, and then here's our internal template. Now, just to cycle back and forth between all three of these, if you really just kind of like squint your eyes a little bit, look towards like the center of your nose, they're all basically the same thing. We're not doing anything crazy every time we release a new framework. We're really just rehashing the same ideas. We want to have something that is not in the browser, put it in the browser, and have custom functionality. Yet we need frameworks to do this. So yeah, when you say, oh, this framework is so much better because it does this in such a different way, no one's impressed. No one really wants to look at this brand new framework when we have all these other ones that all try to do the same thing. But what if, hear me out, if I had a perfect meme, it'd be the ancient aliens. What if there was a way that we could do this with standards, right? So who's heard of a web component before? Who's actually written and used a web component? Simon, put your hand down. You don't count. Hey, I don't care what your mom says. You're cool. So web components, for the uninitiated, the few people that are out there, it is a standard way of saying, hey, I have a custom tag, and it has its own predefined functionality. Browser, handle it. It's super easy to polyfill, too. So if you want to, say, add support for IE11, because IE11 still exists, you can polyfill a lot of the internals of a web component to a degree. If you try to make certain things work in IE11, you're just going to have a bad time. But the big feature here is that it's built into the browser. It's part of the standards. Safari supports it as a Mac and Safari user. That's awesome. But also Firefox, Chrome, and even Edge will support it in their newer releases. And it's really built up of these three concepts. We have this custom elements definition. Basically, we have a custom tag. That's really all we're doing. We're saying we have a custom tag, and here's its implementation detail. So for instance, we can make our own image component, which we'll look at later on. But we're just going to say we have a tag. It has its own functionality. Browser, do whatever you need to do. We have a template element. Who's heard of the template element before? OK. So template element is kind of, it's a quiet thing. It's essentially a way for us to create kind of templating parts on the client side, which is pretty awesome. And then there's Shadow DOM, which is a lot cooler than it actually is, or sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. But it's essentially a way for us to say, here's the internals of our component, hide it from the user. So if you've ever inspected a video element or a text input, and then you can dig down deep into like the internals of the markup that makes up that component, that's Shadow DOM. So that's when you see those weird pseudo selectors to dive really deep. Oh, I want to change the placeholder color for this text input. This is how we can do this. That's all Shadow DOM being Shadow DOM. So this is a pretty simple example. If you want to see the actual repo for this, github.com/perlbay/betterimage. This is a better image component that a friend of mine has created, where essentially we're saying we have a vanilla web component. And in this vanilla web component, we're just going to create a, hold on, let's get to it. We're going to create an image, but to the user, we're going to expose like this. We're going to have a bitter image tag. We're going to give it a URL, a fallback URL, and then some accessibility text because we're good developers. So anytime that main URL fails to load the image, we're just going to load the fallback URL, so that way we can have some kind of way to handle this. This could be a base64 string, so you could have like a little 1 by 1 pixel, like gray square, or it could be in total new image, whatever you want. Now that's pretty nice. If we dive into that code, I highly suggest it. It's a great way to learn about the internals of web components. But it's very low level. Kind of designed that way by browser implementers. They want everything to be super low level, so that way you never have to use it. You have libraries that are built on top of it to make it a little bit more palatable. But some of the things that are missing are reactive data binding, having some kind of templating. So you notice that example used inner HTML to actually set the content. Would be great if we had some kind of templating system. I like TypeScript. That was all JavaScript. I'd rather have TypeScript because the tooling is that good. And then stuff like server-side rendering, another new buzzword that we should worry about, or template pre-compilation. Not going to say that again. But basically, these features, they're kind of there, but it'd be nice if all of this stuff was just provided out of the box. And we at Ionic have been working on a little project to actually add this. And it's called Stencil. You know, the black background in the white SVG. I really wish I made that bigger. Oh well. So Stencil is another framework. We like to think not. If you've ever used Babel, we're kind of along that same line. We essentially take your code, apply a whole bunch of transforms on it, and what gets outputted is a legit web component that can be loaded in the browser and loaded on IE 11 to all the latest evergreen browsers. Instead of trying to force our own opinions on how things should be done, we borrowed a lot of concepts from different frameworks. So we're going to see some JSX from the React. We're going to see some decorators from Angular. And somewhere in there is some Vue API, but I'm not quite sure where it exists nowadays. And yes, like I said, JSX and virtual DOM for speed, so that way we can start doing batch updates of all of our data bindings and not cause any layout thrashing. So Stencil, again, yes, it's not a framework. We really believe that frameworks actually do serve some good. If you are trying to build huge applications, you're probably going to want to have some kind of a framework. Building stuff with just web components, it can work, but it's not going to be a fun time. These are why frameworks exist. So Stencil will work with all these other frameworks, Angular, Vue, React, or even no framework if that's your preference. So this is our hello world. Give you guys a sec just to kind of take it all in. So this is basically can be broken down into like 3 or 4 parts. We have this act component decorator, which essentially is just going to say, hey, this class underneath it, here's the implementation detail. And when we want to render this out, we're going to look for the my name element. We're going to include some styles. Maybe we want to use some kind of scope CSS or just have some global CSS. And we can also pre-process that with Sass if that's your thing, or you could just use regular CSS as well. The main implementation detail is in this class. And then we have this prop decorator. Now this prop decorator does something pretty interesting where we can say we have a class member called name, but then we can also export it out so that way the user could pass that in on the element. If you think an image tag, this is the equivalent of a source. So essentially we just say, I have my name, I'm going to pass name on the element itself, and it's just going to render that out in our little render function down here. We'll say, hello, my name is, and then just do some JSX data binding to this .name. And it's as simple as that. We just have my name equals Mike. That's really all it is. That's all we need to do to create a web component in the browser. So let's take a look at an actual demo, and we're gonna build better image with Stencil. So I use Vim, so don't judge me. And we're just going to start up a little library load server. The details of that you don't really need to know, but we'll open up our dev tools, make them a little bit bigger and easier to read. And we'll say, hello, I am, don't call me framework JS. And we can see we have my component. We're exporting first on our component and last. And well, name's not Stencil. And my name is definitely don't call me a framework JS. So So cool, we have changed these properties on our component, and the component was able to detect that and re-render automatically. And just to prove that's not any other magic, let's go ahead and say for d equals document.create element. We'll just say my component. So we'll say d.last is going to equal Hartington, d.first. If you guys didn't really catch that, it knows that first is a valid property on the element, so the dev tools can even pick this up. So we're putting all of this knowledge back into the actual component. So this is all standard stuff, nothing crazy going on. We'll just say the first name is going to be Mike again, and then document body append child. Cool. So now, again, this is all just running in the browser, all web components. We inspect the second one, and here we go. We have all of this data rendered out for us. Now, you notice that it doesn't actually have the props declared on the component because we set them through JavaScript. Let's add an attribute. So we'll say first, and I'll enter my fiance's soon-to-be last name. Oh no, that didn't work. There we go. So now it knows that not only can you set those things through JavaScript, you can set them on the component itself, and it'll also it'll render everything out for that. The code for this, it's really just a glorified step up from our hello world. We have our first and last props, and then we have this div that's just returning hello world, I'm first name and last name. So this is pretty cool. We could load this up in React. We could load this up in Angular. We could even load this up in Vue, and it would just be able to handle that. But let's take it a step further and make better image. So like a smart speaker, I have the boilerplate already set up. We're going to include some copy and pasted code because Stack Overflow. We'll copy this. We'll import that stuff that we needed. And we'll handle the rest of this in here. So just to better understand what's going on, it's not reloading. All right. We have our properties where we're setting the URL, the fallback. We actually can supply the defaults. For instance, this is going to load an image. I wonder what this image is going to be. And then we actually have our prop for the accessibility text. Great. Now, whenever we whenever the first image fails, we'll remove the error handler or remove the event listener, and then we'll just set the image source to use the fallback. And then to render this, we'll return an image. It's going to have a reference to the image itself using this ref function. We have the source, where all we're doing is just setting the data binding, the accessibility text, and then we're just setting up the event listeners for this. So we'll save. We'll watch the browser reload. Cool. And then I will be a smart person. Copy and paste my way to glory. And because I know what's going to happen, so here we have our little placeholder puppy, probably thinking about something super deep. Let's go ahead and break it. So we're going to say, oh no, I made a bad copy and paste error, and it forgot to load the image. I am particularly proud of the heckin' good time. I feel like this is my spirit animal. Okay, we can fix it, we'll save, and it'll load the appropriate image. Now that fallback URL, we could actually supply a base64 string, like I said earlier, and it would just handle that automatically. So we have a lot of flexibility here. It didn't need to know about the fallback, but because we supplied it in the class. But we have all this stuff just working. So, you know what? I'll be a little risky. We're going to actually show an app I wrote that's using the pre-release version of Ionic, rebuilt using web components, but inside of Angular. Let's hope ngserve actually works. This is what happens when you go off script. It's actually been quite fast, so I'm pretty impressed with that. One too many zeros. Cool, so we have our app working right now. And if we actually look at any of this, for instance, we don't really care what the app is doing. We have all of these little components here. This one's specified as ion header, but this is just a web component. So we can prove this by looking at the source and looking at all of the different components that we're loading. Come on, let's actually get to a good component. It's gonna be so disappointing if I can't find one. But you notice that all these components that are in here, these are all being loaded on demand by the web component loader. And as you scale these up to maybe 1,000 components, if you're using Stencil, it will automatically load them and lazy load them for free. So totally off the cuff, but pretty nice to note that it will automatically lazy load them. I don't have a whole lot more, but if you do want to check out more of the documentation and more of the details of Stencil, definitely check out StencilJS.com. We're rebuilding our entire company around this project, so we think it's going to be pretty nice and integrate pretty well with all the rest of the JavaScript ecosystem. Thank you.